The first scream of the babies nearly vanished beneath the roar of the river. "Stop the carriage!" But the command came too late. The bridge shuddered beneath the wheels as the swollen waters of the River Swale struck its pillars like cannon fire. Lantern lights swung wildly in the storm, revealing the impossible truth. The bridge was breaking apart. Inside the carriage, a man wrapped his arms around two tiny bodies bundled in blankets. His jaw tightened as the wood beneath them cracked again. "Hold on," he murmured to the infants. The next moment the world gave way. Wood splintered. Horses screamed, and the carriage plunged into the raging river. Half a mile away, Grace Hartwell stepped onto the narrow porch of her stone cottage and froze. The rain had not stopped in 5 days. It fell now in long silver sheets across the Yorkshire hills, soaking the earth until the fields had become a trembling sea of mud. Grace had lived beside the river all her life. She knew its moods. Tonight it was furious. The swale had already swallowed the lower pastures. Dark water crept steadily toward her cottage fence, carrying broken branches and torn pieces of fencing like trophies of destruction. Grace tightened her shawl against the cold wind. 8 months. 8 months since she had buried her husband in the small churchyard beyond the hill. 8 months of silence inside the cottage that had once been filled with 2 voices. Now every decision was hers alone. And tonight, the river was deciding something terrible. A sudden crack split the air. Grace's head jerked toward the sound. The bridge. Another thunderous crash followed. Grace ran across the wet grass toward the fence line just as lightning tore across the sky. The flash illuminated a nightmare. The bridge had collapsed completely, and tangled in the shattered beams was a carriage being dragged slowly downstream by the violent current. Grace's breath caught. For one single moment, she hesitated. The river was death tonight. Anyone who stepped into that water would likely never come out. Then she heard it. A cry, thin, weak, but unmistakable. A baby. Grace did not think again. She lifted her skirts and ran straight into the flooded pasture. The icy water hit her boots first, then her ankles, then her knees. The cold was so sharp it felt like knives slicing through her skin. The current clawed at her legs, trying to pull her down. But the cries came again, 2 of them now. Grace forced herself forward until the broken carriage loomed beside her, trapped against a fallen tree trunk. Her hands gripped the shattered door. Inside, wrapped in soaked blankets, lay 2 infants in a wicker basket. Both were screaming with terror. And beside them, a man, unconscious. Blood streamed from a deep cut across his forehead, mixing with the river water that poured through the carriage. Grace's heart hammered. She had seconds. The log holding the wreckage groaned loudly. If it shifted, the entire carriage would be dragged into the deeper current. Grace seized the basket first. The babies were heavier than she expected, but she pulled them against her chest and turned back toward the bank. The river fought her every step. Water climbed to her waist. Her soaked skirts wrapped around her legs like chains. Twice she slipped. Once she nearly fell, but she did not stop. Not while those tiny cries trembled against her chest. When she reached the muddy bank, she placed the basket safely on the grass and covered the babies with her cloak. Their faces were pale, but they were alive. Grace sucked in a breath of air. Then she turned back toward the river. The carriage groaned again. The man inside would not survive another minute in that water. Grace stepped back into the current. This time the river struck her like a wall. She staggered but forced herself forward until she reached the wreckage again. The man was large, far heavier than she expected. But she grabbed his coat collar and pulled with all her strength. The carriage shifted. The broken log snapped. For one horrifying second, the river nearly tore him from her grip. Then his body slid free. He fell into the water. Grace grabbed his shoulders before the current could claim him. Step by step, inch by inch, she dragged him toward the shore. The river rose higher against her waist. Her arms burned. Her lungs felt ready to burst. But finally, her boots struck solid ground. Grace hauled the unconscious man onto the bank beside the crying babies and collapsed to her knees. Behind them, the shattered carriage tore loose and vanished into the darkness of the river. Grace sat there shaking in the rain. 3 strangers lay before her. 2 helpless infants, and a wounded man whose face, even in blood and stormlight, carried the unmistakable bearing of someone powerful. Grace did not yet know his name. She did not know that half the noble families of England feared him. She did not know that powerful men believed him already dead. She only knew one thing. Saving them had just changed the course of her life forever. The babies stopped crying only after the fire was lit. Grace knelt beside the hearth, feeding small pieces of dry wood into the flames until warmth slowly filled the little stone cottage. The storm still raged outside. Rain lashed the roof and wind rattled the shutters, but inside the room the light of the fire flickered softly across the walls. For the first time since the river had nearly taken them, the babies slept. Grace sat on the floor beside the wicker basket, studying them carefully. 2 boys, nearly identical, perhaps 6 months old. Their cheeks were pale from cold, their dark lashes still damp from tears. One had a tiny mark just behind his ear. Grace brushed her finger across the mark gently. "Little fighters," she murmured softly. Her gaze drifted toward the man lying near the hearth. She had dragged him across the pasture with strength she had not known she possessed. Now that the danger had passed, she could finally see him clearly. He was younger than she first thought. Perhaps 30? Dark hair? Strong features sharpened by exhaustion. But what struck Grace most were his hands. Even in unconsciousness, they were not the hands of a farmer or merchant. They bore scars, old ones, the kind men carried from swords or pistols. Her eyes shifted to the coat she had removed earlier to dry beside the fire. Heavy wool, fine stitching, and on the inside cuff, an embroidered crest. Grace frowned. She did not know much about aristocratic houses, but she knew enough to recognize a noble crest when she saw one. Whoever this man was, he was not ordinary. A weak sound escaped his throat. Grace looked up quickly. The man stirred, his brow tightening as pain dragged him slowly back toward consciousness. His eyes opened, dark, sharp, and immediately searching the room like a man waking in enemy territory. "Don't move," Grace said calmly. His gaze snapped to her. For several seconds he simply stared. Confusion, disorientation, then memory struck. "The boys!" He tried to sit up. Pain stopped him instantly. Grace stepped forward and pressed a hand firmly against his shoulder. "If you move again, you'll tear your stitches," she said quietly. "They're safe." His breathing slowed. "Where?" "My home," Grace replied. "You fell into the river. I pulled you out." His eyes closed briefly as if piecing together the fragments of the night. "The bridge." "Gone." His jaw tightened. "And my sons?" Grace gestured toward the basket near the fire. The man turned his head carefully. The moment he saw the baby sleeping peacefully, something in his expression changed. The hard tension melted into something raw and unguarded. Relief, pure and unmistakable. Grace watched him closely. Only a father looked at children that way. After a long moment, he lifted his gaze back to her. "Who are you?" "Grace Hartwell." "This is my farm." She met his eyes directly. "And you?" There was the smallest pause. Too small to fool someone who had lived through loss and learned to listen between words. "Henry," he said. "Henry Barlow." The lie was immediate. Grace recognized it at once. His voice carried the crisp accent of educated aristocracy. His posture, even injured, was one of command, and the crest on his coat did not belong to any Barlow family she had ever heard of. But she said nothing. "You were attacked," she said instead. "Do you remember what happened?" Henry's gaze drifted toward the fire. Fragments returned slowly. A dark road, the sudden gunshot, the driver collapsing from the seat, 4 men emerging from the hedgerows, the horses bolting, the bridge appearing too quickly. Then the fall, cold water, the babies crying. His jaw tightened. "I remember enough." "Who were they?" He hesitated. "I don't know." Another lie. Grace folded her arms but did not press further. Instead, she asked quietly, "The boy's mother?" The question struck something deeper. Henry's eyes moved back to the sleeping infants. "She died," he said simply. Grace nodded once. "I'm sorry." Silence settled between them. The fire crackled softly. Rain beat against the roof. Then Henry spoke again. "You live here alone?" "Yes." "No husband?" "He died last winter." He inclined his head slightly, a quiet acknowledgement of shared grief. Then his expression hardened. "You said the bridge collapsed?" "Yes." "How long until it can be crossed again?" Grace looked toward the dark window. "Days," she said. "Maybe longer if the river keeps rising." Henry's jaw clenched. "That's a problem." "Why?" He did not answer immediately. Instead, his eyes moved toward the door, toward the storm outside, then back to her. His voice dropped. "They'll come back." A cold chill slid through Grace's spine. "Who will?" Henry's gaze darkened. "The men who tried to kill me." The words hung in the warm room like a blade. Grace stared at him. "You're certain?" "Yes." "Why?" He held her gaze. "Because they didn't finish the job." Outside, thunder rolled across the Yorkshire hills. Grace looked at the sleeping babies, then back at the wounded stranger lying in her home. She had pulled him from the river without hesitation. But now, watching the shadows flicker across his face, she realized something terrifying. She had not just saved a man, she had brought danger into her house. And if his enemies came searching, her quiet life would vanish with the morning. The fever came before dawn. Grace knew the signs long before Henry did. His breathing had grown uneven during the night, and by morning his skin burned beneath her hand. "Don't try to rise," she said firmly as he attempted to push himself upright. "I'm fine." "You are not." Grace pressed him back against the mattress she had made from folded blankets near the hearth. His body trembled despite the heat of the fire. The wound on his forehead had begun to swell beneath the bandage. Infection. Grace had seen it before. Her husband had once cut his arm with a scythe. She had stitched the wound herself. For days he had burned with the same terrible heat. She forced the memory away and soaked another cloth in cold water. "Drink," she said. Henry turned his head away. "I said I'm fine." Grace's patience snapped. "You nearly drowned, you were half frozen, and someone tried to split your skull open," she said coolly. "Forgive me if I doubt your medical judgment." For a moment he simply stared at her. Then, unexpectedly, his mouth twitched. A ghost of a smile. He took the cup. The babies stirred in their basket as his voice disturbed their sleep. Grace moved quickly to lift them before their cries could begin. The small one with the mark behind his ear yawned loudly. His brother blinked up at her with solemn curiosity. Grace adjusted the blankets and rocked them gently. Henry watched her in silence. "You handle them well," he said. "I had younger siblings," Grace replied. "That helps." A faint cry escaped one of the boys. Grace reached for the small spoon beside the hearth and dipped it into the warm goat's milk she had prepared earlier. "Open," she whispered softly. The baby obeyed immediately. Henry frowned in mild disbelief. "You make it look easy." "It isn't," she said. "Then why do they obey you?" Grace shrugged. "Perhaps they sense I won't argue with them." The corner of his mouth lifted again. The moment surprised them both. Grace quickly looked away. Something had shifted in the room. Not comfort exactly, but something less sharp than the tension that had existed since he woke. Henry watched her feed the boys carefully, spoonful by spoonful. Her hands were steady, her movements instinctive. The babies quieted quickly in her arms. "You said you had no children," he said. "I don't. But you seem capable?" He nodded. Grace hesitated before answering. "I always thought I would have them one day." Her voice softened. "My husband and I married young." She placed the sleeping baby back beside his brother. "We expected time." Henry understood that tone. He had heard it before. It was the voice of plans that had never been allowed to exist. For a while neither spoke. The only sound in the room was the quiet breathing of the babies, and the wind rattling the shutters. Finally Grace asked, "What are their names?" Henry looked toward the basket. "Thomas and William." She pointed gently. "The mark behind the ear?" "Thomas." Grace nodded thoughtfully. "I was calling him James." Henry almost laughed. The movement hurt his ribs enough to stop him quickly. Grace noticed the pain. "You should lie still." "I've been lying still too long." "You'll live longer if you continue." His eyes met hers again. "You speak like someone used to giving orders." "Only to stubborn men." Another faint smile flickered, but it faded quickly. His gaze drifted toward the window again. The storm clouds were still thick outside. "How long until the road's dry?" he asked. "Long enough," Grace said carefully. "Long enough for what?" "For your enemies to believe you drowned." The word struck him harder than expected. Grace stepped closer. "You said they'll come looking." "Yes." "Then we must give them no reason to search here." Henry studied her. "You would help me hide?" Grace hesitated only a moment. "There are 2 babies in that basket." She folded her arms. "I doubt I could sleep knowing I sent them back into danger." Henry's expression changed again. Something deeper this time. Something like reluctant admiration. "You barely know me," he said quietly. "No," Grace replied. "But I know men who protect their children." She gestured toward the sleeping twins. "And men who lie badly." Henry stiffened slightly. "You know, you're not Henry Barlow." Silence fell instantly. The fire crackled between them. For a moment Grace wondered if she had pushed too far. Then Henry exhaled slowly. "You're perceptive." "I'm observant." He studied her face. "You haven't asked who I really am." Grace shrugged lightly. "If it matters, you'll tell me." "And if it doesn't?" "Then I prefer not to know." Henry leaned back against the pillow. A woman who did not chase secrets was rare, but somehow comforting. He closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, his voice was quieter. "You may regret helping me." Grace met his gaze without flinching. I suspect I already will. For a moment, neither moved. Then one of the babies stirred and let out a tiny sigh in his sleep. Grace looked down at them, and Henry watched her with a strange realization forming in his mind. The river had almost taken everything from him. But somehow, it had carried him here. The fever finally broke on the second night. Grace noticed it first. Henry's skin, which had burned for hours beneath her hand, had begun to cool. His breathing grew deeper, steadier, less strained. She replaced the damp cloth on his forehead one last time and allowed herself a slow breath. "You stubborn man," she murmured softly. The babies slept nearby, curled together in their basket beside the fire. Thomas stirred first. His small hand reached blindly through the blanket until it closed around Grace's finger. The tiny grip surprised her. So small, yet determined. Grace watched him for a moment, something warm tightening quietly in her chest. She had never held a child this long before. Her husband had died before that dream had ever become real. Grace brushed a curl from Thomas's forehead and stood slowly. She had just turned toward the hearth when a voice spoke behind her. "You stayed." Henry was awake. His voice was rough but clear. Grace turned back. "Yes, you could have left." "Left 2 babies and a dying man?" Henry studied her face. "Many would." Grace gave a small shrug. "Many people are cowards." He almost smiled again, but the expression faded when his eyes moved toward the basket. "Thomas," he said softly. "And William." Grace nodded. "They have strong lungs, that they inherited from their mother." There was something different in his voice when he spoke of her. Something quiet, respectful. "What was her name?" Grace asked gently. Henry did not answer immediately. His gaze rested on the fire as if searching through the flames for a memory. "Catherine." Grace waited. Henry continued after a moment. "She died the night they were born." The words were calm, but the silence afterward carried grief that had never quite healed. "The doctors tried everything," he said quietly. "But the bleeding wouldn't stop." Grace knew that tone. She had heard it in her own voice months ago when people asked about her husband. "She held the boys once," Henry added. Then she smiled and closed her eyes. Grace's throat tightened. "I'm sorry." Henry nodded faintly. The grief between them did not need explanation. Grace turned back toward the fire and added another piece of wood. The flames rose higher, lighting the room. For the first time since he arrived, Henry looked around the cottage properly. It was small but warm. A table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed behind a curtain. The sort of place where life was simple because it had to be. "You live here alone?" he asked again. "Yes." "Entirely alone?" "My father's farm is 2 miles away," Grace replied. "But I prefer my own roof." Henry looked toward the door. "Your father must worry." Grace's lips curved faintly. "He knows worrying rarely changes anything." A quiet cry interrupted them. Grace turned quickly. Thomas was awake again. She lifted him carefully and held him against her shoulder. The baby immediately settled. Henry watched the ease of her movements. "You've grown attached already," he said. Grace paused. "Perhaps." She rocked the child gently. "And you?" she asked. Henry frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "You've barely held them." The words were not accusing, just honest. Henry's jaw tightened. "I was injured." "Yes." "And before that?" He hesitated. Grace saw the truth before he spoke. "You were afraid." The word hung quietly in the room. Henry looked away. "I almost lost them in that river." Grace stepped closer and placed Thomas carefully in his arms. Henry froze. The baby stared up at him, then gave a small happy sound. Grace folded her arms. "They are still here." Henry looked down at his son. The child's tiny fingers wrapped around the collar of his shirt. Something shifted inside him. He had spent weeks running, hiding, fearing the men who hunted him. But in that moment, the danger felt farther away. For the first time since the attack, Henry felt something unexpected. "Peace," Thomas yawned loudly. Grace laughed softly. "That one is determined to sleep through disasters." Henry looked at her. "You laugh easily." "Not easily," she corrected. "Just when I remember how." The answer lingered between them. Outside, the storm had finally begun to fade. The rain softened into a gentle drizzle. Grace moved toward the window. "The river is falling," she said quietly. Henry followed her gaze. "Yes." Silence stretched between them again. Then Grace spoke. "You'll leave when the road's clear." Henry did not answer immediately. Instead, he watched her reflection in the glass. "Yes," he said eventually. "And when you do?" He hesitated. "You'll take them with you." "Yes." Grace nodded once. Her expression did not change. But something in her eyes grew distant. Henry noticed. And for the first time, he wondered why the thought of leaving suddenly felt less simple than it had before. The rain stopped on the fifth morning. For the first time in nearly a week, sunlight spread across the Yorkshire hills, pale and uncertain after the long storm. Grace stood by the cottage window with William in her arms, watching the river beyond the pasture. The water had begun to retreat. Broken branches and splintered fence posts lay scattered across the fields like the remains of a battle. Behind her, Henry had managed to stand for the first time without staggering. It had taken several attempts. Now he leaned against the doorframe, breathing slowly while Thomas gripped his coat with determined fingers. "You should still be resting," Grace said without turning. Henry looked toward the pasture. "The river's falling." "Yes. That means the roads will open soon." Grace nodded. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Thomas let out a pleased babble, tugging Henry's collar. Henry shifted him higher in his arms with surprising care. "You've grown stronger," Grace said. "The boys help." "That's not what I meant." Henry understood anyway. His fever had broken 2 days earlier, and color had finally returned to his face. The wound across his forehead was healing, though the bruise beneath it remained dark and stubborn. "You saved my life," he said quietly. Grace shrugged. "I saved 3. Henry's gaze moved to the babies. "Yes." Silence followed, but it was no longer the cautious silence of strangers. It was something quieter, something that had begun forming during the long nights of fever and crying infants. A rhythm. Grace turned from the window. "I need to check the goat," she said. Henry nodded. "I'll watch them." Grace hesitated for the smallest moment. Then she handed William to him. The baby studied Henry seriously before grabbing his beard with fierce determination. Henry winced. Grace laughed. "They like you. They attack me." "Same thing." She stepped outside before he could answer. The barn smelled of damp hay and warm animals. Grace milked the goat quickly, but her thoughts wandered. The cottage had begun to feel different. Not full exactly, but less empty. The boys' cries, Henry's low voice humming to calm them, the quiet conversations by the fire, all of it had filled the spaces that grief had left behind. And that frightened her, because the river was falling, which meant Henry would leave. Grace finished milking and returned toward the house. She stopped when she reached the porch. Through the open door she could see Henry seated near the hearth. Thomas slept across his chest. William lay curled in the crook of his arm. Henry was humming softly, the same tune he had used to calm them during the night. Grace remained in the doorway longer than she intended. The sight struck something inside her chest that she could not quite name. Henry looked up and caught her watching. For a moment neither spoke. "You're smiling," he said quietly. Grace blinked. "I wasn't." "You were." She stepped inside quickly, placing the milk on the table. "You imagined it." Henry did not argue, but the small smile remained. Grace busied herself with warming the milk, her back turned to him. "You'll leave soon," she said suddenly. Henry's voice came slower this time. "Yes." "When?" "As soon as the river crossing is safe." Grace stirred the milk carefully. "And where will you go?" Henry hesitated. Then he answered honestly. "Home." Grace turned slightly. "To your estate?" "Yes." She nodded. "That's good." Henry studied her profile. "You sound relieved." "I am." The answer came too quickly. Grace realized it at once. She set the spoon down and faced him. "It means the boys will be safe." "And you?" Grace lifted one shoulder lightly. "I was safe before you arrived." Henry knew that was not entirely true, but he did not challenge her. Instead, he said quietly, "You've done more for us than I can repay." Grace shook her head. "You don't owe me anything." Henry's gaze darkened slightly. "That isn't true." "Henry." It was the first time she had spoken his name like that. Soft, almost careful. He looked up. "You don't need to pretend with me anymore." His expression stilled. "I know you're not Henry Barlow." The fire crackled softly. Grace stepped closer. "The way you speak, the crest on your coat, the way you carry yourself." She met his eyes calmly. "You're a nobleman." Henry said nothing. Grace continued quietly. "And someone important enough that men would risk hanging to have you killed." A long silence followed. Thomas stirred slightly in his sleep. Finally, Henry spoke. "Yes." Grace waited. Henry drew a slow breath. "You deserve the truth." He shifted Thomas carefully and looked directly at her. "My name is not Henry Barlow." Grace nodded once. "I suspected." His voice lowered. "I am Alexander Ashford, Mom." He paused, then finished the sentence that changed everything. "The Duke of Somerville." Grace stared at him. For several seconds the room felt strangely silent. A duke, in her cottage, holding 2 babies she had been feeding with a spoon. Grace finally exhaled slowly. Well, she said quietly, that certainly explains the assassination attempt. Alexander almost laughed, but when their eyes met again, neither of them smiled, because suddenly the space between a duke and a farmer's widow felt far larger than the small room around them, and both of them had just realized it. Grace did not speak for several seconds after his confession. The fire cracked softly between them, throwing warm light across the small cottage walls, but the atmosphere had changed. A duke, not merely a nobleman. A duke, the kind of man whose name appeared in newspapers and whose decisions affected entire counties. Grace folded her arms slowly. Well, she said at last, that is unfortunate. Alexander blinked. Unfortunate? Yes. She gestured vaguely toward the door. It means the trouble chasing you is far larger than I hoped. Alexander almost smiled despite the tension. You're not impressed? Grace met his gaze calmly. You nearly died in my river and bled on my floorboards. Titles lose their shine after that. For a moment, the honesty stunned him. Most people reacted very differently when they learned his identity. Shock, fear, flattery. Grace Hartwell merely looked mildly irritated. You should have told me sooner, she added. I wasn't certain you would help. Grace raised an eyebrow. You believed I would throw 2 babies and a wounded man back into the river because of a title? Alexander had no answer. Silence stretched again. Finally, Grace spoke more quietly. So your cousin wants you dead? Yes. And if you die? He inherits the duchy. And if the boys die as well? Alexander's jaw hardened. The title passes directly to him. Grace exhaled slowly. That explains the carriage attack. Alexander nodded. It wasn't robbery. It was succession. Grace moved to the window, staring toward the quiet pasture. So what happens now? I return to London. Her head turned sharply. Already? As soon as I can travel. Grace frowned. You're barely healed. I don't have the luxury of waiting. He shifted Thomas gently in his arms. My cousin believes I drowned. That gives me time. For what? To expose him. Grace turned back fully. And how do you plan to do that? Alexander reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled out a folded letter. I sent a message. When? 2 nights ago. Grace's eyes widened. You left the farm? Only briefly. You crossed the river? There's a fallen tree near the bank. Grace stared at him in disbelief. You could have died. I've already come close enough to death to become impatient. She took the letter from him. The wax seal bore a crest far more elaborate than the one on his coat. Grace frowned. Who did you send this to? Alexander's voice lowered. The only man powerful enough to protect my sons if something happens to me. Grace looked up. Who? The Duke of Wellington. The name filled the small cottage like thunder. Grace knew it even from this remote corner of Yorkshire. Everyone did. You know him? My father served under him during the war. Alexander's expression darkened. He owes my family a favor. And you believe he will help? I believe he will listen. Grace handed the letter back slowly. And if he cannot? Alexander looked toward the babies. Then I keep running. The words were simple, but the exhaustion behind them was not. Grace studied him quietly. You plan to take the boys with you? Yes. That's dangerous. So's leaving them here. Grace hesitated, then spoke carefully. No one knows this farm. Alexander looked at her. You believe they won't search here? They believe you drowned? Grace gestured toward the river. The carriage disappeared downstream. Your enemies likely think the river buried you. Alexander considered that. Grace continued. You could go to London alone. And leave my sons behind? For a few weeks. Alexander's expression hardened immediately. No. Listen to me. Grace stepped closer. You're injured. You'll be traveling through roads where anyone might recognize you. She lowered her voice. If someone attacks you again, the boys would be defenseless. Alexander said nothing. Grace continued gently. They are safe here. His gaze flickered toward the basket where William slept. You care for them, he said quietly. Grace looked down. They need someone. And you? Her voice softened. I'm only the woman who happened to pull them from a river. Alexander studied her face. You've done far more than that. Grace did not answer. Outside, the late afternoon light stretched across the pasture. The storm had finally passed. But inside the cottage, something heavier had taken its place. Alexander looked toward the door. I must leave within 2 days. Grace's chest tightened slightly. And when you return? If Wellington helps. His voice trailed off. Grace finished the thought. You'll take them home. Yes. Silence settled again. Grace nodded once. That's how it should be. Alexander watched her carefully. You sound certain. I am. But when she turned away toward the hearth, he noticed the way her hands trembled slightly, and for the first time since the river, Alexander wondered if leaving might cost him something he had not expected to lose. The morning Alexander left, the sky was pale with early mist. Grace had been awake long before sunrise. She stood in the quiet cottage kitchen, warming milk over the fire while the babies slept in their basket beside the hearth. Everything looked the same as it had the day before. But nothing felt the same. Behind her, Alexander fastened the last button of his coat. The wound on his forehead had healed enough to travel, though the faint scar would remain. Grace avoided looking at him. If you leave now, she said quietly, you'll reach the main road before midday. Alexander watched her for a moment. You sound like you're sending away a traveler. Grace stirred the milk slowly. That is what you are. He stepped closer. Grace. She finally turned. The early light from the window touched her face, soft but resolute. Your sons will be safe here, she said. I know. And when you return, her voice faltered only slightly, you will take them home. Alexander held her gaze. Yes. The words felt heavier than they should have. Behind them, a small cry broke the silence. Thomas had awakened. Grace moved immediately, lifting him from the basket with practiced ease. William stirred soon after, reaching toward Alexander instinctively. Alexander picked up the second baby and held him close. For a moment, the four of them stood there together in the small cottage, an odd little family created by a storm. Grace adjusted Thomas's blanket. You must leave soon. Alexander nodded, but he did not move. Instead, he studied her face carefully. You believe this ends today? Grace lowered her eyes. Doesn't it? Alexander looked down at his sons, then back at her. Grace, when I imagined leaving this place. His voice slowed. I expected relief. Grace forced a small smile. That's understandable. But I don't feel relief. The words hung quietly between them. Grace's hands stilled. Alexander stepped closer. You saved my life, he said. You saved my son's. That was chance. No. His voice deepened. That was courage. Grace shook her head. It was necessity. Alexander watched her carefully. And the nights you stayed awake with them? The fever? The way they calm the moment you hold them? Grace's throat tightened. They needed someone. And you needed them. Her eyes lifted quickly. That isn't... Alexander interrupted softly. Yes, it is. Silence settled again. Outside, the first sunlight spread across the pasture where the flood had once raged. Alexander took a slow breath. I went to London believing my life was already decided. Grace frowned slightly. What do you mean? I believed my duty was simple. To protect the duchy. To protect my sons. To return to the world I came from. Grace nodded slowly. That seems reasonable. Alexander stepped even closer. But then I returned here. His voice softened, and discovered something unexpected. Grace's heart began to beat faster. What? Alexander looked directly into her eyes. A home. Grace's breath caught. You already have one. Yes, he said. But it's incomplete. Grace stepped back slightly. Alexander. He continued quietly. In London they offered solutions. Political marriages. Alliances. Women with titles that would strengthen the duchy. Grace felt the distance between them again. That sounds appropriate. Alexander shook his head slowly. But none of them could do what you already have. Grace frowned. And what is that? Alexander glanced down at the babies in their arms. You became their mother without being asked. Grace's chest tightened. I was only helping. No. His voice was firm now. You were loving them. Grace looked away. Alexander stepped closer again. Come with me. She turned back sharply. What? To Somerville. Grace stared at him. That's impossible. Why? Because you are a duke. And I am a farmer's widow. Alexander did not hesitate. Then marry me. The words filled the room like a sudden storm. Grace's eyes widened. That's madness. Is it? Yes. Her voice trembled slightly. You belong to a world of titles and society. And you belong here. Alexander's expression softened. I belong wherever my family is. Grace's breath faltered. They will never accept me. Perhaps not at first. And the scandal? I've faced worse. Grace looked down at the babies. They deserve a proper mother. They already have one. Her eyes filled with tears. You barely know me. Alexander smiled faintly. I know enough. He reached out slowly and took her hand. You faced a flooded river to save my sons. You held them through nights of fever and fear. You challenged a duke without trembling. His voice lowered gently. I would be a fool to let you disappear from our lives. Grace tried to speak, but no words came. The quiet cottage seemed to hold its breath. Finally she whispered, if I come with you, my life will change forever. Alexander nodded. So will mine. Grace looked into his eyes. The same eyes she had first seen through rain and blood on the riverbank. The same man she had slowly begun to trust. And perhaps, without realizing it, to love. Thomas stirred in her arms. William tugged Alexander's collar again. Grace laughed softly through her tears. They seem impatient for an answer. Alexander smiled. I suspect they already know it. Grace took a slow breath, then nodded. Yes. Alexander's relief was immediate and unmistakable. He leaned forward and kissed her gently, not with urgency, but with quiet certainty. The storm that had brought them together was long gone, but something stronger had taken its place. And as the morning sun rose over the quiet Yorkshire hills, Grace Hartwell stepped forward into a life she had never imagined, not as the widow who lived beside the river, but as the woman who had changed a duke's fate forever.